Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today. My name's Deborah Garlick from Henpicked Menopause in the Workplace, Menopause Friendly and Menstruation. And today for something a little bit different for us at Henpicked. And we're going to be covering how to manage PMS, Premenstrual Syndrome. And of course, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome back one of our all-time favourites, and that is Jackie Lynch, the registered nutritional therapist. How are you doing, Jackie?
I'm good, thank you, Deborah. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you very much. And I said a little bit different because, of course, we're always talking about menopause. We talk a lot about menopause and have done for years and years and years. Looking at this from a menstruation and menstrual health perspective, I think, and I was asking you earlier, how many people do we think actually experience severe symptoms of PMS? And we've both got to a point of going, probably all of us at some point. And it's particularly pertinent for those of us in peri, I think, too. So going to jump straight in and say, what is PMS and why do we get it?
Well, PMS, premenstrual syndrome, I think important first of all to clarify what a syndrome is. In the same way as IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, is a syndrome, these are not medical conditions as such. They are a collection of symptoms. And what that means is that different people experience different things. So it won't be, well, my PMS won't be the same as yours and won't be the same as your mum's or whatever, because everybody's different. It's that collection of potential symptoms. You'll get some, but not all, varying degrees of severity. And they occur after ovulation, which happens in the middle of the cycle, and in the days running up to the actual first day of bleed, your actual period. And the symptoms are many and varied because it can depend on each of us as to what it might be, but it can include things like mood and memory issues, fatigue and sugar cravings, bloating and water retention, headaches, sore boobs. It can happen in lots of different ways, and that's what makes it so tricky in some ways.
You know, Jackie, it's interesting hearing you talking about this and the cycle. And for me, actually, putting it out there, it's a distant memory to an extent, because I can remember in my cycle, there were days when I could take over the world and I was superwoman and, absolutely full of energy, full of everything. And then there was a certain time of the month when it would be, I just want to sit on the sofa, eat chocolate, watch Netflix, just
Yeah.
really wasn't myself, and my energy levels were really down. And being I'm going to call him the Metro Man, I know he's listening in actually, so he'll probably come and give me his view in a moment. My husband always bought my tampons. And one day I said, it's really nice of you. Is this on your diary? And he went, no, I always know when I need to buy them. And I think it was that point in the month when I'd got to a
Yeah.
itchy and scratchy
Yeah.
type of mood. That was the moment that he put the tampons on the shopping list. You don't always recognize, do you? Unless you take a moment and say, you've got a cycle, you may be different in different parts of your cycle, and PMS really is a thing then.
Oh, it's most definitely a thing. But you're right, we're busy, we've got lots going on and life sort of goes on. So sometimes we don't make that connection. And sometimes you need someone else, in fact, in the same way as your husband did, to make it for you. And of course, the thing is, it's not completely understood. We don't really know exactly what the cause is, although there is no doubt that there is a hormonal connection. And it's thought that, low levels of estrogen and progesterone, or high levels, or the reverse, or a bit of both, and ups and downs are the factor. And of course, as you said, it's often worse in perimenopause because these hormones are fluctuating wildly. So you might have been used to a little bit of irritability and short fuse, maybe in your 20s and 30s, but suddenly it can feel, and you get to your 40s, that you can almost feel your blood pressure rising at these moments. So I think it's important to understand that the hormones are going all over the place.
But for different people, there might be different symptoms. So what sort of range of symptoms are we looking at here, other than the symptom of eating a lot of chocolate, which was clearly one of mine?
Well, it can depend. For example, issues with progesterone, particularly because progesterone is the one that governs a lot of the emotional and psychological symptoms. So if you've got an imbalance in progesterone and you're more sensitive to progesterone, which is the case for certain women, what that can mean is that you're more likely to be the one who's tearful, anxious, or super irritable and very angry, or just feeling generally low. So there's that whole gamut of the sort of emotional and psychological and often cognitive symptoms too. Women in perimenopause generally often talk about issues with brain fog, but it can be an issue in PMS for women of any age, actually, depending on how sensitive you are to what's going on with your progesterone levels. For other women, it can be the estrogen that's a bit more of an issue. For example, women who are prone to premenstrual headaches, menstrual migraine as it's known, often that's linked to estrogen, in fact, and an imbalance of estrogen, which is why some of them find they can't take the oral contraceptive pill, or they don't get on with HRT further down the line, for example. Um, Bloating, lots of IBS type symptoms. So not unusual for women to have, tummy upsets, loose stools, and that sense of just feeling really bloated around the middle. And of course, sore boobs is a classic.
Yeah, that and actually that's not fun, is it? That was one that when I looked through and we were talking about it earlier, and I thought actually I'd forgotten that one. That they, your boobs can be. So is that bloating or is that something else that's going on? Because I always used to think that they swelled around that time.
Well, it's definitely a form of water retention. I mean, interestingly, I know we're going to come on to diet in a bit, but interestingly, often if you're someone who has a lot of caffeine in your diet, caffeine contains high levels of compounds called methylxanthines, and it's thought that they can contribute to issues with sore boobs in premenstrual. So, not saying you can't have your cup of coffee, but perhaps if you're having an awful lot of caffeine in your diet, easing back might make a difference.
Right. Okay. So, it is that know yourself and recognize some of these things, but as a syndrome, you can be affected. But it's interesting you say about the what you can what you eat manage PMS, because as I say, something was triggering go to the chocolate cupboard for me, and was that something in me that was a something that was missing? Is it comfort food? Why was it I was craving so many sugary snacks? Is that normal?
Well, it's not unusual, let's put it that way, because your hormones are all over the place. And when your hormones are all over the place, that's going to disrupt what's going on with the appetite signaling in the body, for example. So, it's not unusual. But I think the thing to know about the role of diet in managing your PMS is that consistency is everything, because the hormonal fluctuations are actually determined over the whole course of the cycle. So there's no point in only, quote, being good in the bit where you've got the PMS, because you're laying the groundwork for what's going on with those hormones earlier in the month. So thinking about some of the things we're about to talk about on a more long-term basis is going to be much more effective for you.
That's interesting because I thought it would be just sort of you'd be giving me swaps to do instead of my chocolate or something like that. It's are you saying that's actually in effect helping balance your hormones throughout the month?
Correct. Yeah, absolutely. Because they're doing their thing in the background. They're going up and down and doing all sorts. It's a very clever system, the reproductive system. And mostly you don't notice. It's just doing its thing, and that's quite right. You get on with your life. But it's when you've got too much of one or not enough of another, and the balance isn't quite right. That's when you can suddenly start to feel it. Whether it's in terms of incredibly strong craving for sugar, or whether it's the fact you just want to crawl up in a little ball and cry. It can affect you in lots of different ways.
So she says, "Did you hear the deep breath then?"
I did.
So what are the recommendations in terms of what you can eat that will influence the severity maybe of PMS?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the first one is, of course, my old favourite, which is keeping your blood sugar nicely balanced. Because If you keep your blood sugar stable, you're avoiding the peaks that can be caused by having large amounts of sugary foods and refined carbohydrate, because what goes up must come down. The body's got its own corrective system for blood sugar. You don't need to be wearing lots of monitors and doing all sorts of crazy stuff. The body knows what it's doing as long as you give it the tools to do the job. So if your blood sugar spikes, insulin kicks in and it scoops it all out, sends it off to the liver to be stored, and that's when your blood sugar will crash. And that's the problem, because that's when your stress hormones come out, cortisol and adrenaline. And adrenaline is the one I'm going to focus on here, actually, because too much adrenaline can actually interfere with the action of progesterone in the second half of the cycle. So that can very much contribute to anxiety and irritability. So if you're a bit of an adrenaline junkie, if you're under a lot of stress at work, then at the very least, what you can do is balance your blood sugar so that your diet isn't contributing to that. And two key nutrients for that, I know we've talked about this, you and I, before, Deborah, it's protein and fibre. So complex carbohydrate, brown stuff, the body releases that more slowly, keeps the blood sugar nice and stable. So brown bread, brown rice, brown pasta, oats, or vegetables, for example, great source of complex carbohydrates. And then protein is hard to digest, so it slows down the release of the carbohydrate even further, keeps you going for longer, keeps that blood sugar nice and stable, so that extra adrenaline isn't pumping out to disrupt your hormones. So that's what we'll be thinking about. And good sources of protein, the classic meat, fish, eggs, of course, but also lots of lovely plant proteins, things like quinoa, soya, nuts, seeds, lentils, chickpeas, beans, hummus, for example.
So no quick fixes there then, Jackie. I wasn't hearing any quick fixes.
Well, there are some. There
Oh,
are
can I
some.
have the quick fix, please?
Well, I think it's always good to get the basics right. Let's talk about magnesium, because magnesium is nature's karma. And if you're one who feels quite jittery, and often friends say to me, "Oh, I'm feeling really hormonal," and what they mean is they're just feeling sort of super anxious and emotions all over the place. Magnesium's great because it's nature's karma. And so good sources of magnesium would be things like leafy green vegetables, a couple of handfuls a day of things like spinach, rocket, kale, watercress, cabbage. That can really help. There also, by the way, magnesium is a game changer for anyone struggling with those premenstrual headaches I talked about, because it actually relieves the tension in the blood vessels. It plays a big role in our vascular health. So if you're getting a lot of sort of tension headaches around here, magnesium's the one. And while I'm not one to normally recommend large amounts of supplements, particularly outside of a clinical setting, it is worth knowing that, between 200 and 400 milligrams of magnesium glycinate in those days, that's your quick fix, Deborah, in those days running up to the period, can really help both with those who struggle with headaches, regular headaches, the kind of headaches that are relieved on the first day of bleed, but but nothing will touch them up to that. Magnesium might.
Okay, so magnesium, let's come back to that one, because you said magnesium glycinate, and I know there are different sorts of magnesium. So I'm thinking here of anybody that's listening to this, and the glycinate is the one that's easier on your tummy.
Yes, yes. I'm a big fan of magnesium citrate, but for some people it can be a little bit irritating. Good if you've got constipation, because it will help sort things out a bit. But if you're going in the other direction, it's not so good. So given that I don't know any of you, and I don't want to be making blanket recommendations, probably glycinate would be the better form. But always check with your doctor if you're on any medication or if you have any medical conditions before you start taking it, because you need to check there's no potential interaction there.
Is that the one that's good for sleep as well?
Yeah, well, they both are. But yes, glycinate will be good for sleep.
Wonderful. Thank you. So I've got my quick fix number one.
Okay. Thinking about omega-3 fatty acids, because a lot of the issues that are going on around your PMS are due to the action of things called inflammatory prostaglandins. And these are hormones which are on the march in the run-up to your period, and they can cause a lot of the issues around the sense of bloating and IBS. So looking at an anti-inflammatory approach, thinking about eating more in the way of oily fish like salmon, sardines, mackerel, for example, using things like flaxseed, a couple of tablespoons of ground flaxseed in your cereal or in your smoothie, for example, walnuts, almonds are all great sources. Now, some women find that supplementing with things like starflower oil or evening primrose oil can help. But a note of caution there, both of those are omega-6. Now, omega-6 is great, but it's there's an element within the omega-6 called GLA, and then it needs to convert to either the anti-inflammatory pathway or the inflammatory pathway. And some women will find that these oils work really well for them. Others might find they don't, because not everyone converts it very well, and it might end up going the inflammatory direction. The good thing about omega-3 is that it only goes to the anti-inflammatory pathways, so will help to reduce those issues.
Okay, and am I eating the oily fish and all of those things around the time that I'm expecting PMS, or at certain cycles, or throughout the month?
Hey,
I love oily fish anyway, so
ideally throughout the month, because the body loves consistency, but you wanted quick fixes, it will still help massively in that short period.
I was looking on it as this is my run up to my period diet.
You also need to think about what you shouldn't be having, of course. So we've talked a little bit about caffeine. I think I saw a little thing that popped up there that methylxanthines are the compounds that can be problematic around the sort of sore boob situation. Alcohol is another issue. You know, the liver is, if it's too busy sorting out your alcohol, reducing those toxins, it won't be able to metabolize your hormones and get rid of the old hormones so the balance is right. So again, if you're up and down like this, then you need to be aware that giving the liver a bit of time to actually take over and sort out hormone balance is good. So reducing alcohol is definitely a winner when it comes to PMS.
Any preferred or least bad alcohols? She said, hopefully.
No, I mean, it's more about just being careful. So, I mean, you know, if you're someone who has a little bit of something every day, then it's not the week to be doing it. So even if you're just doing something like 3 consecutive alcohol-free days each week as a minimum, consecutive is important because it will give the liver time to catch up on its jobs and start to sort out your hormone balance. So that already could be a bit of a game changer, for example.
Oh, and to be clear, Jackie, I was asking for a friend.
Of course, absolutely. We all have those friends. Um, Another thing just worth mentioning is salt, because if you're struggling with bloating and discomfort, then high salt foods can really help to reduce increase issues around water retention. So perhaps reducing adding salt to your diet, or maybe look at some of those rock salts that you can get in health food stores, because they tend to be lower in sodium. And also avoiding high sodium foods, things like red meat, processed meats like bacon, salamis. Cheese is actually very high in salt. And in fact, halloumi, you know, when you have one of those sort of halloumi slabs you get on a salad, for example, that contains 3 grams of salt per 100 grams. So one of those slabs is nearly your entire recommended maximum of 6 grams of salt a day. Halloumi is super salty.
Ah, tragic. Well, for those of us who love a halloumi. So we've got some top tips there. You did mention supplements briefly. Well, and that, just recapping, that was the omega-3, magnesium, glycinate. Any others? Are there any of the B ones that might help?
Well, if you tend to get a bit sort of ratty and tired, then B vitamins, quite often a good one to go for is a combination of B vitamins and magnesium all in one. So you're not pumping yourself with lots of different pills, because that gets very boring. And that can be really good to sort of work together, because vitamins and minerals are designed to work in synergy together, really calming the nervous system, helping with any of those emotional issues, but also dealing with fatigue, because you can often feel wiped out before your period.
Right, okay. So I can see that we're getting lots of questions in the chat, and I was just going to see if my colleague Sarah wants to join us and ask some of those questions for everybody that's joining us today.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Deborah. And thank you, as always, Jackie. Amazing advice. Just touching on the fatigue one, actually, a couple of people have asked about this, saying any advice, when you get that physical fatigue and that muscle ache a week before, is there anything you could advise around that?
Yeah, I mean, this is where magnesium really comes into play again, because as
Mm-hmm.
well as dealing with our headaches and our issues around sort of stress and anxiety, magnesium regulates muscle function. So it's really good for tired, aching muscles. And in fact, you can get some lovely magnesium sprays that you could sort of rub straight in directly onto the muscle, which are absolutely excellent. Epsom salts bath is another one, 2 or 3 handfuls of that, because that's magnesium sulfate in the bath, and that can really help with the sort of aching muscles. But magnesium is also our ignition key because it kickstarts the entire energy production process. So again, it's an absolute winner. If you can think about having more magnesium through the course of the month in the form of your leafy greens every day, and then perhaps consider a bit of extra magnesium support in the form of sprays or salts, or perhaps a supplement if you're able, if medication doesn't get in the way, then that could be a good shout for you.
Fantastic, thank you. Yeah, and somebody had asked that question earlier about the magnesium salts. That's great, that's picked up on. There's a number of things, Jackie, that have been asked for people about their appetite. Appetite goes, full stop during times of the month, and they just tend to want, as you were talking about earlier, that craving of chocolate, those fatty foods, which they're saying they don't eat very often, thankfully. Is this a typical craving?
I mean, it is because your hormones have gone on the march. And when the hormones are on the march, everything,
Mm.
they affect all the hormones. It's not just the sex hormones, they affect your stress hormones. They affect your the hormones that govern and regulate appetite, such as ghrelin and leptin. So the simplest thing you can do, and it goes back to the very first thing I mentioned, is keep that blood sugar balanced. Because if your blood sugar stays stable, then you won't have the blood sugar crash, which will activate the cortisol, which triggers, it's cortisol that triggers so many of those sugar cravings. So think protein, really, if you're feeling full, then you're not going to be in the same situation. You might think, oh, I quite fancy a chocolate, but I can do without it, as opposed to, let me at it. So making sure you're having protein with every meal and every snack. And if you want a little bit of a sweet treat, think maybe, well, I'll have a piece of fruit. Maybe I'll have an orange because that's quite sweet. Or we're getting soon into berry season, which will be nice. And then you could have some nuts with that. So you get your omega-3 from your almonds and you get your protein to keep you going. And then that little bit of sweetness that can just help alleviate some of the craving.
And someone else was saying here, it's just hard to know, when you get those sugary and salty foods, someone's referenced as well, Jackie. Is it down to PMS, or is it just, just normal behaviour? Because we could all get those cravings at times.
Well, I mean, I'm always a bit wary of salt cravings because it does tend to suggest your adrenals are overworked, because that will affect the levels of aldosterone, the hormone in the kidneys, which governs that side of things. So, remember to be super kind to yourself, because we do drive ourselves really hard.
Yeah.
Sometimes, if you know that it's going to be that week, then just think about easing back. Don't overpromise. Calm things down a bit, because that can help a lot.
Yeah. And going back to, someone's just asked here about the bloating, Jackie, that you were talking about earlier, and then someone else is saying, how can you relieve that bloating, and how can you relieve those stomach cramps, which can be, absolutely hideous for some people, as we know.
Right, two slightly different things.
Yeah.
The stomach cramps and the pain, that's going to be the inflammatory prostaglandins. So really thinking about the anti-inflammatory diet and focusing hard on that omega-3 is going to help with that. Bloating's a different ballgame. What you need to be thinking about during this time is, okay, what can I do to not put my gut under pressure? Because during that time, the inflammatory prostaglandins, they really put the gut under pressure and make it sensitive. So you want to be eating things that are easy on the gut. So certain foods are particularly irritating to a sensitive gut. Nothing to do with the immune system. It's not an allergy or an intolerance. It's just that if your gut's sensitive, these are harder to break down. So I would steer clear of a wheat-heavy diet, for example, not having so much bread or pasta or sort of Weetabix, those wheat-based cereals. I'd be looking at having oats or rice perhaps during that week just to be easier on the gut. I'd look at not overdoing the dairy because again that can be quite hard on the gut. So if you're someone, not saying you can't have it, but large cups of a latte, for example, which is just sort of full of milk, or eating ice cream, again, those kinds of things can be just a bit too hard to digest and are often the fast route to bloating. And another common high FODMAP food, because that's the group that these foods are known as, high FODMAP, these irritants to the gut, would be pulses. Lentils, chickpeas, beans can often be hard work on the gut. So if you're following a largely plant-based diet, you might want to be thinking more about quinoa or tofu during that week, just to make it a little bit easier on the gut.
Sick. Thanks, Jackie. And thank you all the questions that are coming in as well. There's so many, and this is brilliant sharing as well from individuals. So you mentioned earlier, Jackie, about the oily fish. We've touched on the supplements. Is there an alternative food option for oily fish? Somebody's asking.
Yes, I think I mentioned omega-3 also,
Omega-3,
flaxseed, ground
Yep.
flaxseed, for
Yep.
example. So that's what you're looking at, a couple of tablespoons. It's not the omega-3 in plant sources like walnuts and flaxseed isn't as immediately active as it is in the animal source, but the body will take it and convert it into what you need. So it's still great. And I'd just be making sure that you're looking at those and avoiding pro-inflammatory foods during this time. So, you know, the alcohol, the sugar, the deep fried foods, for example, those kinds of comfort foods we might move towards are actually going to be exacerbating the problem, I'm afraid.
Super.
May I ask a couple of quick fire ones? Because I'm just through. Magnesium. A quick fire question, because I think whoever wrote this question, I can't, it's off my screen at the moment. Can you have too much magnesium? So if you have a bath, you have a spray, and you're taking it as a supplement, can you overdose on it?
Okay, great question. In terms of oral supplements, the maximum recommended amount would be 400 milligrams. And of course, once again, I caveat, if you have medication, check with your doctor, because magnesium can lower blood pressure, which is often a great thing. But if you're on blood pressure tablets already, then you might end up with dizzy spells or fainting, which you don't want. So do check with your doctor. The transdermal magnesium doesn't affect that because it bypasses that system and it goes straight to the muscles and the things it's trying to work on. So, for example, you could have an Epsom salts bath and take oral magnesium, provided your doctor was happy for you to do that, depending on your medical background.
Thank you. And another one is, would intermittent fasting help during this time?
It might. One of the things about intermittent fasting, apart from the role it plays in weight management, is that it does give the body a break, the digestive system particularly. So operating on something like the sort of 16-8 approach, or the sort of 14, that's not right, is it? Going to get my maths wrong now. But anything where you're sort of fasting overnight, finishing your evening meal early and starting breakfast a bit later, gives the gut a bit more of a break. So 14-10, that was the number I was looking for, is often a good way of doing it. It doesn't work for everybody, but if you've got an oversensitive gut, it might help, yes.
Have you heard, Jackie, of ovulation pain?
Ovulation pain. Yes, it unfortunately, some women do experience that. Always worth checking with your doctor if you get pain during ovulation, just to check that everything's in order. There can be any number of reasons why that might happen. Again, it's generally the start of the rearing of the head of the inflammatory prostaglandins. So again, a longer term approach to an anti-inflammatory diet might be helpful there. But always check in with your doctor if that's something that's happening to you, just to rule out any medical condition underlying.
Thank you. And I'll ask you one more while Sarah looks to see if there's any we haven't answered yet. And that would be for me, and I had exactly the same question, perimenopause and PMS. similarities and differences. How do you know if it's perimenopause or PMS getting worse?
Well, it's probably both, because PMS does tend to get worse. If you're prone to PMS, it's likely to be worse during perimenopause. And so because the hormones are starting to go up and down anyway, and so instead of it just happening the week before your period, it's starting to happen on a much longer basis. So I suppose if you're perimenopausal and still getting your periods, then regularly, I mean, you inevitably you're still getting them if you're peri, then it's sort of getting that sense of, okay, is it just the few days before my period, or is this how I am all the time now? Because if this is how you are most of the time, then it's more likely to be perimenopause, which will impact on the PMS for sure. But if it's just those few days before, then it's more likely to be PMS, albeit possibly worse because you're in peri.
Thank you. And so, of course, all of those suggestions that you made earlier will be just as helpful if it's perimenopause or if it's PMS.
Absolutely, absolutely. It works all around. And whatever your age, even if you're not perimenopausal, if you're, an 18-year-old struggling with these issues, then all the things I've talked about will still be just as helpful.
Thank you. One final question, and I am sorry, I have got an extra one. Does it matter? Does PMS, PCOS and PMS working together? All of the suggestions you made earlier, will that still?
PCOS, so that's polycystic ovarian syndrome. That's a whole other ball game, really, because the imbalance there can often lead to higher levels of testosterone. So that's not sort of directly necessarily part of the same thing, but inevitably, because you've got that whole dance of the hormones pre-PMS, then you may find that some of your PCOS symptoms are becoming exacerbated during that time. It's possible, yeah.
Thank you very much, Jackie. I think that's all we've got time for. So I'll say thank you very much, Sarah, for answering questions or collecting the questions in the background. And thank you all very much for joining us today and participating in this session. And thank you, as always, Jackie, for your wonderful expertise, absolutely answering all of those questions. We hope you'll join us all again. And one question we did have that I've answered, yes, this recording will be available and we will be making the information available to you as an article. So you can check on Handpicked Menopause Hub and watch it again or share the article. So thank you very much, everyone, and all the best.